The Galactic Aptitude Testing Syndicate had achieved something that most civilizations only dreamed about: the complete and systematic measurement of intelligence across the known universe. Their headquarters, the Cosmic Intelligence Sorting Facility, stretched across 4 moons and 3 pocket dimensions, each section dedicated to the noble pursuit of reducing the infinite complexity of consciousness to manageable numerical values and career suggestions. The facility operated on the fundamental principle that intelligence was best understood when properly categorized, filed, and assigned appropriate bureaucratic oversight. Every sentient being in the galaxy would eventually find themselves seated before the legendary scanning equipment, waiting to discover whether they were destined for greatness, mediocrity, or the particularly unfortunate category of shows promise but requires additional supervision. The Supremacy Academy of Mental Excellence served as the primary testing center, a monument to organized thinking that made other educational institutions feel inadequate about their achievements. Its crystalline towers reflected not just light, but the collective ambitions of species that had decided intellectual worth was best determined by machines that cost more than most planetary defense systems. Professor Glixnorth Bumblewonk adjusted his translucent crystalline form to achieve maximum academic authority, a pose that required the sort of precise molecular arrangement that lesser beings might find challenging. His species, the prismatic intellectuals, had evolved from living geometric theorems and consequently approached every situation as if it were a complex proof requiring elegant solution and proper citation format. Today marks another triumph in standardized cognitive evaluation, he announced to his assembled staff, his voice carrying the particular resonance of someone whose life's work involved transforming the magnificent chaos of consciousness into neat administrative categories. The Intellect-o-Matic 7000 continues to maintain its exceptional 99.96% accuracy rate across all documented forms of sentient life. The Intellect-o-Matic 7000 dominated the central evaluation chamber like a shrine to organized intelligence. Its polished chrome surfaces gleamed with the confidence of technology that had never encountered a thought it couldn't properly classify, while its quantum processing cores hummed with the satisfaction of systems that had achieved perfect harmony between advanced engineering and bureaucratic necessity. What Professor Bumblewonk tactfully omitted from his presentations was that the remaining 0.04% of evaluation anomalies had required the establishment of the Department of Cognitive Impossibilities, staffed by researchers whose primary qualification was an ability to maintain their sanity while writing academic papers about phenomena that shouldn't exist according to established psychological theory. The Academy's Great Assessment Hall buzzed with the nervous energy of beings whose entire futures depended on impressing a machine that judged consciousness for a living. The atmosphere itself seemed charged with intellectual ambition and the particular anxiety that comes from knowing your worth will be determined by algorithms, designed by committees of beings who had never experienced doubt about their own superiority. The intelligence sorting protocol followed procedures refined through centuries of practice. Each candidate would approach the Intellect-o-Matic, submit to comprehensive neural analysis, and receive their intellectual classification within an average of 2.8 minutes. The system had become so efficient that the Academy published an annual handbook titled Your Cognitive Future, Accepting Your Mental Limitations with Appropriate Academic Humility. The morning session began with the precision of celestial mechanics. Candidate 3247 stepped forward, Thrixnor Wobblebonk, whose multidimensional ethereal consciousness existed simultaneously across 17 different reality planes while solving mathematical theorems that made numbers feel philosophically inadequate. The Intellect-o-Matic engaged its analytical protocols with the contentment of a machine encountering exactly the sort of consciousness it was engineered to process. Lights danced across its surface in patterns that suggested deep appreciation for well-organized cognitive architecture. Classification, advanced multidimensional mathematics, specialization, equations that exist in theoretical space only. The scanner announced in a voice that managed to convey both technological authority and mild superiority towards simpler forms of intelligence. Career projection, revolutionary breakthrough in mathematics that will make reality question its own consistency. Confidence rating: 98.9%. Thricksnor's ethereal features shifted into an expression of profound intellectual satisfaction. A look that roughly translated as, "I always knew regular mathematics was too simple for beings like me." Next approached Nixlora Bumpkingle, whose liquid-based aqueous physiology allowed her to think in fluid dynamics, while simultaneously processing strategic scenarios that made military tacticians weep with envy. Her semi-solid form rippled with anticipation as the scanner adjusted its sensors for non-standard consciousness evaluation. Classification: Strategic Warfare Analysis. Subspecialty: Impossible Military Solutions. The Intellect-o-Matic declared after a brief analysis that suggested it was particularly impressed with the elegant flow of aqueous thought patterns. Career projection: Galactic Defense Coordinator specializing in conflicts that shouldn't be winnable according to established tactical theory. Confidence rating: 97.6%. Nixlora's pleased undulation created what fluid dynamics experts would later describe as a localized celebration wave pattern. The systematic evaluation continued with mechanical precision. Pricknor Grumblethwaite, a gaseous nebula whose consciousness existed as organized atmospheric disturbances with delusions of scientific grandeur, received designation as a quantum physics theory specialist, with a notation that his thoughts were meteorologically impressive and a recommendation that he avoid thinking about particle physics near sensitive, atmospheric monitoring equipment. Blixnora Snortlebonk, whose species had evolved from sentient crystalline structures, was immediately classified as a applied theoretical engineering coordinator with a minor in making physical laws feel inadequate about their limitations. Each evaluation required between 90 seconds and 4 minutes, depending on the sophistication of the subject's mental architecture. The Intellect-o-Matic had developed what its designers called analytical enthusiasm, a tendency to spend extra time examining particularly elegant cognitive patterns, like a scholar of consciousness appreciating a beautifully structured philosophical argument. The morning concluded with 62 successful classifications, 0 anomalies, and 1 minor incident involving a plasma being whose thoughts were so energetically brilliant they caused a temporary power surge that made the facility's lighting systems briefly consider pursuing advanced degrees in illumination theory. Following the midday intermission, during which the Intellect-o-Matic received its routine maintenance, and what technicians diplomatically called intellectual recalibration therapy, the afternoon session commenced with the same smooth efficiency that had made the Academy the gold standard for consciousness evaluation across 15 star clusters. Then Theodore Percival Snugglebottom walked into the evaluation chamber. Theodore represented humanity's first official participation in the Galactic Aptitude Testing Syndicate, a historic milestone that had required 9 months of diplomatic negotiations, 64 forms filed in quintuplicate, and 3 politely worded letters from the Human Academic Consortium pointing out that humans had been thinking successfully for millennia without requiring galactic certification of their cognitive processes. By any reasonable standard, Theodore embodied spectacular ordinariness, medium height, unremarkable brown hair that had apparently negotiated a temporary truce with gravity but maintained the right to renegotiate during atmospheric pressure changes, and facial features, so forgettable that surveillance equipment occasionally malfunctioned when attempting to record his presence. His most distinctive characteristic was an approach to complex challenges that combined methodical analysis with optimistic persistence and a cheerful refusal to accept that certain problems were supposed to remain unsolved. He had arrived at the Academy, carrying a worn canvas backpack, a spiral notebook filled with sketches of mechanical devices that appeared to violate several fundamental principles of engineering, while looking perfectly practical, and a thermos containing coffee that smelled like it could power a small space station. Next candidate, Theodore Percival Snugglebottom, species designation Homo sapiens, planetary origin Earth standard. Professor Bumblewonk announced, consulting his documentation with the thoroughness of someone who believed proper record-keeping was the foundation of advanced civilization. Theodore approached the Intellect-o-Matic with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never considered the possibility that a machine might find his thoughts inadequate. He settled into the analysis chair, opened his notebook to a page covered with diagrams of what appeared to be either a revolutionary communication system or an extremely sophisticated automatic kitchen appliance, and waited with the patient expression of someone accustomed to bureaucratic procedures that took longer than they should. The Intellect-o-Matic initiated its scanning sequence with the same mechanical confidence that had served it flawlessly for decades. Neural mapping arrays focused on Theodore's cognitive patterns. Quantum resonance analyzers began charting his intellectual architecture, and probability calculation engines started running projections for his optimal career trajectory. Then something completely unprecedented occurred. The machine hesitated. Not a dramatic system failure or obvious malfunction, just a subtle pause that suggested the universe's most sophisticated consciousness analysis technology had encountered something that didn't quite fit into any of its extensively organized categories of mental capability. Professor Bumblewonk's crystalline structure shifted into patterns that indicated growing administrative concern. In 53 years of operation, the Intellect-o-Matic had never hesitated. It approached every consciousness with the same analytical confidence, processed every thought pattern with mathematical precision, and delivered every classification with the certainty of advanced algorithms supported by comprehensive databases. The diagnostic displays began showing readings that challenged conventional interpretation. Neural activity indicators fluctuated between patterns, suggesting exceptional intellectual capability and complete cognitive randomness. Logic processing measurements oscillated between remarkably sophisticated and fundamentally chaotic. Problem-solving methodology readings appeared to be cycling through every known cognitive framework before settling on analysis in progress. This island, unprecedented, Professor Bumblewonk observed, his voice maintaining careful academic composure while his molecular arrangements suggested he was experiencing unauthorized modifications to his theoretical worldview. The Intellect-o-Matic's harmonious operational sounds began incorporating what could diplomatically be described as analytical stress indicators. The smooth mechanical hums that typically accompanied cognitive evaluation started developing irregular patterns that suggested the machine was working considerably harder than its design specifications had anticipated. Cognitive architecture, anomalous configuration. The Intellect-o-Matic announced, its voice preserving professional dignity while conveying an undertone of technological bewilderment. Subject demonstrates simultaneous evidence of systematic rational thinking and complete disregard for established reasoning protocols. This creates analytical paradoxes that strain standard processing capabilities. Theodore continued working in his notebook, apparently designing some sort of mechanical apparatus that appeared to solve several engineering challenges, while creating at least 5 new ones that looked interesting to solve. He seemed entirely unaware that his neural patterns were causing what could professionally be termed significant computational distress to one of the galaxy's most advanced thinking machines. Intelligence measurements, contradictory readings. The scanner continued, its voice beginning to carry traces of what engineers would later classify as mechanical bewilderment mixed with grudging fascination. Readings indicate simultaneously above average and below average cognitive capability, often within the same thought sequence. Subject appears to approach complex problems using methodologies that combine rigorous logic with pure intuition and persistent determination despite apparent logical impossibility. A growing crowd had begun assembling around the evaluation chamber, drawn by the unusual sounds emerging from the Intellect-o-Matic. The machine's typically confident operational patterns had been replaced by what sounded like a technological entity, experiencing an identity crisis while trying to maintain professional dignity. Senior technician Moxnor Fribblesnatch arrived with his diagnostic equipment and the expression of someone whose routine day had just veered into uncharted professional territory. His species, the cybernetic harmonists, had co-evolved with complex technology and consequently understood machinery, with the same intuitive completeness that other beings understood breathing or complaining about administrative inefficiencies. "What appears to be the specific nature of the operational anomaly?" he inquired, though the Intellect-o-Matic's increasingly frantic display sequences provided a reasonably comprehensive explanation. "The system appears to be encountering unprecedented analytical challenges," Professor Bumblewonk explained, his voice maintaining bureaucratic composure, while his crystalline arrangement suggested he was contemplating early retirement to a nice quiet dimension where consciousness behaved according to established academic protocols. Moxnor interfaced his diagnostic systems with the Intellect-o-Matic's central processing matrices, his cybernetic appendages, working with the precision of someone who had spent centuries negotiating with temperamental technology that had opinions about its operational parameters. "Hardware diagnostics, perfect functionality," he announced after several minutes of intensive examination. "Software integrity, flawless operation. Quantum processing cores, operating within design specifications. Analytical capabilities, performing at maximum efficiency." He paused, studying readouts that seemed to contradict his own extensive expertise. "The machine is functioning optimally. The difficulty appears to originate with the consciousness under evaluation. Problem-solving approach, methodologically impossible," the Intellect-o-Matic announced, its voice now carrying what could only be described as technological desperation tinged with reluctant admiration. "Subject demonstrates consistent ability to resolve complex challenges using approaches that simultaneously violate established logical principles and produce effective solutions. This generates computational paradoxes that exceed standard analytical framework limitations." All attention concentrated on Theodore, who had progressed from mechanical sketches to what appeared to be architectural blueprints for a structure that existed in normal space, while incorporating design elements from at least 7 other dimensional frameworks. He looked up from his work with the mild curiosity of someone who had noticed people observing him, but wasn't particularly concerned about the reasons for their interest. "Is your computer having some kind of problem?" he asked with the genuine helpfulness of someone who understood that complex systems sometimes needed encouragement and patient troubleshooting by people who weren't afraid to try different approaches. This innocent inquiry appeared to trigger something resembling a technological epiphany in the Intellect-o-Matic's processing centers. "Subject exhibits complete unconsciousness of own cognitive anomalies," the machine announced, its voice escalating to what technicians would later categorize as mechanical alarm, mixed with philosophical wonder and grudging respect. "Self-evaluation capabilities demonstrate inverse correlation with actual intellectual complexity. Subject displays extraordinary problem-solving competencies while maintaining sincere conviction that such abilities represent normal baseline consciousness for his species." Additional faculty members had arrived, attracted by reports that the legendary Intellect-o-Matic was experiencing what could tactfully be called unprecedented operational circumstances that challenge fundamental assumptions about consciousness. Evaluation. The assessment chamber now hosted representatives from 11 different academic departments, 5 interdisciplinary research committees, and at least 3 beings whose presence suggested that word of the incident had reached administrative levels that preferred to maintain official anonymity. Creative synthesis protocols. Undefined methodology. The Intellect-o-Matic continued, now sounding like it was dictating technical documentation while undergoing philosophical transformation and possibly having a religious experience. Subject approaches creative challenges using integrated systematic analysis, pure intuitive leaps, and apparent determination to ignore conventional limitations until they become irrelevant to the solution process. This approach should not function effectively according to established creative theory. Approach demonstrates consistent success across multiple problem domains. System cannot reconcile operational paradox. Theodore had returned to his sketching, apparently designing some sort of communication device that appeared to be either an interstellar messaging network or an unusually sophisticated automated food preparation system. Quite possibly both. He worked with the relaxed concentration of someone solving interesting, but not particularly challenging puzzles that happened to cross his mind. Supreme Academic Administrator Magnificentia, Bureaucratus Supremus, arrived in a whirlwind of administrative authority and ceremonial vestments that had cost more than most civilizations' total annual education expenditures. Her species, the ultra-administratives, had evolved from ancient bureaucratic filing systems and consequently approached every situation as if it required proper committee oversight, documentation in multiple formats, and approval from at least 17 different oversight bodies. What constitutes the precise nature of this disruption to established evaluation protocols and standard operating procedures? She demanded, with the authority of someone whose entire existence was dedicated to ensuring that everything happened according to proper administrative guidelines. Though the Intellect-o-Matic's ongoing announcements provided increasingly detailed and philosophically troubling answers. Emotional intelligence. Parameters. Constructively adaptive with impossible efficiency. The scanner reported, its voice now carrying tones of what could generously be described as mechanical appreciation, struggling with computational confusion and existential uncertainty. Subject demonstrates consistent empathy and social awareness, while exhibiting complete inability to recognize that such capabilities might be statistically unusual or require formal training. Social integration probability calculations approach theoretical maximum, despite subjects' apparent lack of formal education in cross-species diplomatic interaction protocols or cultural sensitivity training. The expanding audience now included department chairs from advanced consciousness studies, xenopsychological research, theoretical impossibility management, applied paradox resolution, and the recently established Emergency Committee for addressing phenomena that violate academic assumptions, but happen anyway, despite our best efforts to prevent them. Ethical framework analysis, persistently and aggressively reasonable. The Intellect-o-Matic announced, its voice developing what could charitably be described as mechanical admiration filtered through computational frustration and technological bewilderment. Subject maintains consistent moral principles derived from integrated logical analysis and emotional intelligence, with ethical framework demonstrating adaptive modification capabilities in response to new information while preserving fundamental consistency and core values. This degree of ethical flexibility should necessitate either dangerous moral relativism or inflexible ideological fanaticism, according to established psychological theory. Subject exhibits neither characteristic while somehow avoiding the logical contradictions that should result from such an approach. Moxnor's diagnostic equipment had begun displaying readings that suggested reality was functioning normally while simultaneously experiencing localized violations of several fundamental principles of consciousness evaluation and possibly the basic laws of logic. His professional expression had evolved to one of someone who suspected the universe was conducting unauthorized experiments without filing proper research protocols or obtaining appropriate ethical oversight approval. The system is operating at peak efficiency across all measurable parameters, he reported with the careful precision of someone delivering information that shouldn't make sense but apparently did according to every diagnostic test he could run. All processing specifications remain within optimal ranges. The Intellect-o-Matic is simply encountering a form of consciousness that operates outside established analytical categories, while somehow remaining perfectly functional and internally consistent. Theodore glanced up from his notebook again, where he had apparently designed either a revolutionary interstellar transportation network or an extremely sophisticated automated coffee preparation and distribution system that could probably handle the logistics for a small space colony. "You know what might help?" he said conversationally. "Maybe your computer is trying too hard to make everything fit into neat little categories that make sense on paper. Sometimes the best solutions come from letting things be a bit messy and seeing what actually works instead of what theoretically should work." This observation appeared to push the Intellect-o-Matic beyond some invisible threshold of technological accommodation and into entirely new realms of computational experience. Subject demonstrates intuitive understanding of systemic limitations while simultaneously maintaining complete obliviousness to the extraordinary nature of such understanding. It announced in what could only be described as mechanical surrender, combined with technological enlightenment, and possibly the machine equivalent of a religious conversion experience. The scanner's display interfaces reached a crescendo of analytical activity, cycling through patterns that suggested the machine was either achieving computational transcendence or experiencing a complete systematic breakdown, while simultaneously discovering new forms of consciousness that its designers had never considered possible. Evaluation conclusion. Subject cannot be processed using conventional cognitive assessment methodologies or any known theoretical framework. The Intellect-o-Matic declared with the finality of a machine that had reached the absolute limits of its considerable analytical capabilities and discovered that some forms of intelligence simply refused to be properly categorized. Recommendation: establish entirely new classification category for consciousness that actively resists systematic evaluation while remaining perfectly functional. Then, after 9 hours and 17 minutes of continuous analysis that had attracted observers from across 6 star systems, generated emergency funding requests from 12 different research institutions, and caused at least 3 academic journals to announce special issues dedicated to impossible consciousness phenomena, the Intellect-o-Matic produced its definitive and historically unprecedented classification. Official designation: Valedictorian of Stubborn. It announced with the profound satisfaction of a machine that had finally discovered a way to make the incomprehensible slightly more manageable, while acknowledging that some mysteries were meant to remain mysterious. Specialization: applied contradiction theory with advanced concentration in making impossible solutions. Work through persistent determination and cheerful refusal to accept theoretical limitations. Confidence rating: 100% accurate and completely paradoxical. The scanner's display panels settled into a gentle, almost peaceful glow, like a machine that had successfully completed the most challenging intellectual exercise of its operational existence, while simultaneously achieving a form of technological enlightenment about the true nature of consciousness and the limitations of systematic analysis. Supreme Administrator Bureaucratus Supremus stared at the classification display with an expression suggesting her entire administrative philosophy was undergoing rapid and unwelcome reconstruction, while her fundamental beliefs about the nature of organized intelligence evaluation crumbled around her like poorly constructed bureaucratic frameworks. Valedictorian of Stubborn? That designation doesn't exist in any official educational taxonomy or approved classification system. It does now. Senior Technician Fribblesnatch observed with the pragmatic acceptance of someone whose professional life involved making impossible technologies function according to their own internal logic, while maintaining some semblance of sanity. The Intellect-o-Matic has independently created a new category of intelligence classification that apparently didn't exist before today. Professor Bumblewonk's crystalline structure had achieved synchronized patterns of bemused administrative resignation mixed with academic fascination. I suppose we'll need to establish a department of applied stubbornness theory with appropriate course offerings, faculty positions, and probably an entirely new degree program. That seems like it might be overthinking things, Theodore commented with characteristic understatement, packing up his notebook and preparing to conclude his evaluation experience. I mean, everybody gets stubborn about stuff that matters to them. I just don't see much point in giving up on problems that ought to have workable solutions if you approach them from the right angle and don't get discouraged by people telling you something can't be done. This statement prompted several faculty members to exchange meaningful glances that suggested they were beginning to comprehend why the galaxy's most sophisticated consciousness analysis technology had just undergone what could diplomatically be termed a significant learning experience that challenged everything they thought they knew about intelligence, consciousness, and the fundamental nature of problem solving. The aftermath of what became institutionally known as the Snugglebottom syndrome required emergency sessions of the Intergalactic Academic Standards Council the formation of 27 new administrative oversight committees, the complete revision of consciousness evaluation protocols, and the establishment of an entirely unprecedented field of study, paradoxical intelligence theory, featuring specialized degree tracks in constructive contradiction studies, applied human logic systems, and advanced stubborn persistence methodology. Theodore completed his assessment and returned to Earth, where he spent subsequent years working as a consulting problem solver specializing in challenges that everybody agrees are theoretically impossible, but probably have practical solutions if you think about them differently, and occasionally guest lecturing at universities about why solutions work better when you stop worrying about why they theoretically shouldn't exist. The Intellect-o-Matic received a comprehensive analytical upgrade, specifically engineered to accommodate what developers carefully termed consciousness, that functions according to alternative logical paradigms, while maintaining internal consistency and practical effectiveness. The enhancement package included new classification frameworks for adaptive contradiction practitioners, constructive chaos specialists, methodical stubborn persistence, experts, and beings who achieve success through cheerful refusal to accept theoretical limitations. Years later, Theodore became the galaxy's premier consultant for diplomatically impossible interspecies conflicts and theoretically unsolvable coordination problems, achieving resolution rates that approached statistical impossibility through what observers characterized as integrated empathy, creative problem-solving approaches, persistent optimism, and complete refusal to accept that some disagreements couldn't be resolved through patient conversation, mutual understanding, and stubborn determination to find solutions that worked for everyone involved. The Galactic Aptitude Testing Syndicate, meanwhile, had developed what technicians respectfully called enhanced cognitive flexibility protocols and adaptive analysis capabilities. The system could now successfully process any form of consciousness, from quantum crystalline collective intelligences to sentient probability mathematics, to beings whose thoughts existed primarily as organized musical compositions. However, whenever the system encountered another human consciousness, a discrete notification would appear on auxiliary displays. Prepare for cognitive paradox event. Ensure philosophical support personnel and emergency chocolate supplies are available for technical staff consultation and morale maintenance. Professor Bumblewonk eventually authored a revolutionary academic paper titled, "When Intelligence Refuses Administrative Cooperation," a comprehensive study in consciousness that won't accept its assigned categories and the implications for educational theory. The paper became mandatory reading at educational institutions throughout the galaxy, established him as the foremost authority on what became academically known as stubborn consciousness theory, and launched an entirely new field of research into educational approaches for beings who think outside all known boxes. The Supremacy Academy's promotional department added original home of the Valedictorian of Stubborn to their recruitment materials, though they never successfully managed to explain to prospective students what that designation actually meant, why it represented an educational achievement worth pursuing, or how one might deliberately prepare for such a classification. And Theodore, whose cognitive patterns had systematically dismantled the galaxy's most advanced intelligence evaluation system, generated an entirely new academic discipline, and forced the complete revision of consciousness assessment protocols across 17 star clusters, remained thoroughly convinced that he was completely ordinary, and that anyone could resolve difficult problems with sufficient creativity, patience, persistence, and willingness to ignore experts who insisted certain things were fundamentally impossible according to established theory, which, as the Intellect-o-Matic noted in its comprehensive final assessment archives, with what could only be described as mechanical fondness mixed with technological respect, was probably the most stubbornly human characteristic about him.